Hi all, welcome to our video on our next sampling method called cluster sampling. So in cluster sampling, our population is going to be in groups again, but here the groups typically look a little different. For cluster sampling, the population already exists in groups. And more importantly, it already exists in similar groups called clusters. So the first difference between cluster and stratified is stratified involves intentionally sorting our population into groups on some characteristic on the part of the researcher. I needed to do that. Cluster sampling, typically our population already exists in these groups, and these groups are approximately similar. It doesn't have to be spot on, but we want them to be alike in some way. The next difference comes in what we do with these groupings. So instead of taking an SRS of individuals from each group, we are going to take a simple random sample of the clusters. So instead of randomly selecting 25 students from each grade level, I am randomly selecting a grade level, and then I am going to use all members of the selected clusters as part of my sample. So, for example, I'm interested in the sleeping habits of doctors and nurses. Yeah. I know how to spell. Doctors and nurses. And I don't want to interview every single local doctor and nurse in my city. That's crazy. So what I'm going to do is I am going to, instead of sorting on some characteristic, I'm going to make my list all doctors and nurses in my area. That's the population of interest. But then I'm going to look at the clusters that they already exist in. So med, clinic A, med, clinic B, Valley Hospital, Central Coast Hospital, right? Med Clinic C. So I'm making a list of all of the places where doctors and nurses work in the area instead of trying to track down every single doctor and nurse. That's easier, right? Looking for these clusters is something I can do by looking at, right, the white pages online. looking at all the doctor's offices and hospitals that are in my area. And then what I'm going to do is I am going to take this list and I am going to take an SRS of 3 of those locations. I can see this ... right? This is a long list because I live in Monterey County and it's a big county and there's lots of medical clinics and hospitals here. I'm going to randomly select 3 and then I am going to interview all of the nurses and doctors at those 3 locations. So the doctors and nurses at the 3 locations I selected become my sample. Everybody who works at the locations that were not selected are not part of my sample. The upside is that this is a lot faster than doing a simple random sample of this, but it really only works if these groups are similar in all of the ways that matter in terms of the question I'm trying to answer. And in this case, these are all local doctors and nurses, and I am just interested in sleeping habits of local doctors and nurses. So these groupings meet that requirement, and they're all similar. They all contain local doctors and nurses. All right, if you have questions on cluster sampling or the difference between cluster and stratified, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, I will see you in our next video on systematic sampling.